Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buhl. Everyone, I am so excited. I get to interview and talk to Brittany Turner again. If you remember early on in the podcast, season one, I think it was season one, we talked in general about songbird care. Today, we're doing a deep dive. We're doing a deep dive on doves and pigeons. So, Brittany, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Gail. I'm super excited today to talk about pigeons and doves. They are a favorite of mine, though we're not supposed to choose favorites in rehab, but they're definitely my favorite. And we'll talk about that some more. You'll hear about it for a very long time today.
Yay. And I know I'm going to learn lots. I do a lot with birds, but not necessarily, especially with young doves and pigeons, and we'll get into that. But a tiny bit of background. You've been with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota for 11 years, I think, right?
I started back in 2013 as an intern in our songbird nursery. And since then, I've worked my way up to now overseeing all of the animal husbandry at the Wildlife Rehab Center. So I am the Rehabilitation Director currently.
Oh, that's amazing. To me, that would be a great job. I love husbandry. I love setting up cages.
Oh, yeah. It's so much fun to get in a new species and have to look up their natural history. And for us, we are very, very high volume. For those who don't know much about the Wildlife Rehab Center, we topped 21,000 patients this year. So just a handful of animals through the door. And we see all of the animals that are in Minnesota wildlife. Raptors go on to the Raptor Center, but otherwise we see a huge variety of species.
It teaches you so much. And I know that there's crossover learning, right? With species that are similar but not the same, and oh my gosh, just how cool. Minnesota, of course, for people who don't know, and of course I'm in Minnesota and love Minnesota, and especially for birds. This is a state that has hundreds of bird species that breed in the spring and summer and other birds that pass through in the fall on migration. So we have a huge number of species. So you guys probably see over 200 species of all animals a year. Do you think?
Yeah, typically it's between 180 and 200, varies by year. But yeah, we see a ton of Minnesota wildlife.
Man, wow. So not only just been at the Raptor Center, the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, but you actually in the past have worked at the Raptor Center too. I know. But you are also a bird watcher. So you, on your spare time, which you don't have much of during the spring and the summer, but you do a lot of bird watching and kind of being out in the world, out in nature and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also do hobby photography of birds, which are, I think, one of the hardest things to do photography of, because by the time you get them locked in focus, they're gone, especially
moving.
Like tiny little warblers. But yeah, I think it was last year I maxed out at like 18 species of warblers in one day. We had a fallout and I just walked in a park and found so many species. It's so much fun.
That is so much fun. And yeah, in the spring, warblers are a tiny bit easier to identify than they are in the fall. But yeah, absolutely amazing. And I know that everybody who listens to the podcast knows that I'm a huge proponent of natural history, that I think it informs every single step of the rehabilitation process. And so, I applaud, and I'm a bird watcher too. So, we share that in common too.
Yeah, I am a big proponent. And if you ever hear any talks I've done at any conferences, I, at this point, feel like I should get a paid sponsorship. But very big proponent of Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Birds of the World. So side note, if you're a rehabilitator working with birds at all, highly recommend it. If you have a subscription with the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association, as a member, you can get into it for free.
Thank you for that plug. And we
Oh,
will
yeah.
make sure in the show notes that we have links to both NWRA and then the Cornell Birds of the World. And I've
Yeah.
used that resource so much.
It's
Uh,
bookmarked on every digital device I have, because
mhm,
if we get in something that I don't know the natural history of, you can immediately get
mhm.
housing, diet, and migration information as well.
Right, right. And weight and size, and I mean, all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. And if you've got a juvenile that doesn't look like the adult, trying the identification, of course, is the number one thing. And so we're going to be talking about doves and pigeons today. So I know that they are your faves. How did they become your favorites and why are they your favorites?
They're just so cute. But that's not the real.
That's
No,
not the real
I think
reason.
they're just such an interesting bird. Everybody sees pigeons, right? Even people who are in the city don't have access to going into large nature preserves and parks. They see pigeons, right? So it's
Hmm.
something that everybody knows. I grew up watching them, right?
Hmm.
And then, of course, doves are also just phenomenal birds. But for me, I got really invested in them back in 2018, working on improving their natural husbandry. I took a deep dive
Hmm.
of how can we improve their care in rehab, because we were having some issues like calcium deficiencies and why, and just digging down into it, I started to specialize in those two
Hmm.
species. Pigeons are a lot hardier than mourning doves. We'll talk about that. But it was really that deep dive, and then I just fell in love with them. I also, my first ever pet bird was a dove that was found outside, had a wing fracture. Turned out it was a non-native, so we are, sorry, domestic, so it couldn't be released. So I ended up rehoming him, and he was my perfect bird. So I got really invested in doves. I now have 5 of them personally.
And they're still teaching you a lot, aren't they? Even though they're
Oh, oh,
domestic, I mean, there's got to be some overlap.
oh, absolutely. So that's kind of how I got started really loving the pigeons and doves, was that deep dive into their natural history and striving to give as best captive care as possible.
Excellent. So when we're talking about pigeons, I think
Yes.
the official informal name, not scientific name, but informal name is rock pigeon. Is that right?
Yeah, that is what they're called now. They used to be called rock doves, and you might
Hmm.
still hear them called rock doves. But in North America, they're not native. So you can consider them feral, is what people usually say. But it is rock pigeon, Columba livia. I looked it up. So they were introduced into North America in the 1600s, and they've thrived, obviously. If you've been to any city anywhere, even
Hmm.
in farm country, you'll see them.
Hmm.
They're really adaptable. They're really hardy. But
Hmm.
yeah, so rock pigeons are the only pigeon species we see here in Minnesota.
So today, basically, we're going to be talking more specifically about rock pigeons. How many species of pigeon are there?
So species of pigeon in the world, I'm not sure.
Hmm.
In North America, there are 12 species of, we'll go into their order and what they are, right? Let's go back a little
Hmm.
bit. So
Okay.
pigeons and doves are in the order of Columbiformes,
Hmm.
which one of my favorite facts that I learned when I was doing research on them is the other family that's in that order included the dodo bird.
What?
Yep.
Are you kidding? Was that the
No,
fun fact you were telling me before that
that
you were
is
gonna
the fun fact that I
she
almost
said she
spoiled.
was gonna surprise me with something, but she wasn't gonna share it before, and that's it? Holy buckets. That's
Yeah,
amazing. I did not know that.
yeah, they're related to dodo birds, which I think is so much fun.
Yes, I agree.
Anyway, so
Anyway,
that's my fun
back to our regularly scheduled program.
right?
Um,
So, in the family of Columbidae, you have all the pigeons and doves. So again, there's 12 species in North America.
mhm.
For pigeons, I believe. Nope, I'm not going to say it because I don't want to say the wrong number. But
Okay, that's
12
fine.
species across the U.S.
Okay.
Um, Again, we in Minnesota, we only see rock pigeons for the pigeon side of things.
Okay.
For doves, our only native columbiform that's still existing, because of course passenger pigeons used to be here too. That's a whole different podcast talk.
I have a special place in my heart for passenger
Oh yeah.
pigeons too, so that might be a very fun one to talk
Uh,
about.
they're so fun. Anyway,
Mhm.
Our only existing native columbiform in Minnesota are the mourning dove. But we also have rock pigeons, and then we do have Eurasian collared doves as well. You can't tell by the name. They are also an introduced species to the US. They don't really belong here. They were introduced in the southern part of the US and have adapted their way up north. So we have small populations in Minnesota, but we rarely see them in rehab, at
Right.
least for us. I know other places do.
Mostly the Eurasian collared are found in cities as well.
At least in Minnesota, they're more in like farm country,
Okay.
kind of rural areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Scientific name for mourning dove.
I'm not gonna pronounce this right,
Don't
but
worry about that.
Danida macrora.
Okay.
Um, I don't have your Asian collared dove scientific
That's
name
okay.
listed, but again, we don't see very many. I think we at the Wildlife Rehab Center see 1 to 2 a year.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, rock
Okay.
pigeons and mourning doves.
Rock pigeons and mourning doves. That's a great deep dive for us today. So we're gonna start out kind of at 30,000 feet level. In general, why do these birds come into rehab?
There's quite a few reasons, some expected, some not. Typically, our admit forms show people just say, we found it not flying, which I know is true for a lot of birds, but especially pigeons. It's always, we found them, it wasn't flying away, so we grabbed it. There's a lot of different reasons for it. We do see window strikes and head trauma. Those are more for mourning doves, which we'll talk the natural history differences. They're in the same group, but rock pigeons and mourning doves, their behavior is very different. So mourning doves more likely to have window strikes. Pigeons can also hit windows and other things. They're flying around buildings, and juvenile birds are not the best at flying. We get a lot of predator attacks. They are a really great prey species, which hurts my heart because I love them so much, but they are a really great prey species for a lot of animals. You think of the peregrine falcon grabbing pigeons downtown, but then, of course, mourning doves, yeah, easy prey for the most part, and they have a lot of meat on them, so it's really great. But we get a lot of
Right.
predator attacks. We also do see pigeons that have lead, which is not something that
Wait,
most would
what?
think about, right? Yeah, so you think of lead and you think of eagles and swans, is what most
Yep.
people think, right? They
Right.
ingested it. We have had some pigeons that I don't remember the year we started testing them, but between 2011 and 2023, we tested 502 rock pigeons for lead, and we had 218 that had detectable levels, and
That's
100,
half.
right? And 137 had lead above 10, which for our center requires treatment.
Wow.
Yeah, so I don't know how they're getting it. For anyone who gets opossums, we also have a lot of, I know, different type of animal, but we also get a lot of Virginia opossums that have lead, and we're not 100% sure how they're getting it. But yeah, one of our first signs for pigeons, for me at least, for having maybe some lead is they're a little bit too friendly as adults, and we test them, and sometimes they're positive.
Isn't, gosh, isn't that interesting? Well,
Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of background lead that is not
Mm-hmm.
normal, right? But because we have lead in everything. I mean, the computers that we're using right now to
Yeah.
record this podcast have a lot of lead, lead pipes, lead I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
just everywhere. So it would make sense to me just knowing a little bit about rock pigeons, you find them in railroad yards, for
Yeah.
example, and they're pecking at the ground and
Mm-hmm.
they're picking up other things besides the spilled seed. They need
Yeah.
grit and things like that.
I don't have the data in front of me, but mourning doves, we don't really test for it because we don't really see symptoms of it. But that makes sense because while mourning doves can be found in urban areas, they're more suburban, rural birds.
Right.
And you think of a lot of the concentration of heavy amounts of lead are usually in the cities.
Uh-huh.
And pigeons will eat whatever they can find. And as you mentioned, they eat grit. So they'll eat dirt and
Mhm.
rocks, and lead seeps into really everything. So,
Right. Wow. It is just one more way and of course, I'm preaching to the choir here with you, but also everybody listening, that how important rehabilitation is
oh,
to
yeah.
the wider world and even human health. And whether it's finding diseases or finding hidden things like this that you wouldn't
Right.
normally think
Nope.
would be an issue.
A few other reasons. These ones are less often, but they still happen. Poisoning. There are still a lot of places, a lot of people who don't want pigeons around. They use poison on seeds or corn. The pigeons eat it because free food, and then
Right.
they have really, really bad symptoms of poisoning. It's really hard to watch if you get in
Hmm.
pigeons that are poisoned. We do see frostbite occasionally, more in
Hmm.
mourning doves. They are adapted to our climate up here, which, if you're not familiar with Minnesota, is cold.
Cold.
Um, but while they're adapted, we do often see mourning doves adults with missing toes. And they're just not quite built well for our really, really cold winters.
Right. Those
Um,
bare little toes.
Occasionally, right? I know they have tiny little feet. We occasionally see them shot, luckily not very often, but we had quite a few years ago now a mourning dove that was actually shot with a blow dart gun and survived that only to then develop frostbite because after it had been shot, it had been on the ground in the winter for a while and ended up developing really, really severe frostbite.
Oh, oh, the poor
I
thing.
know,
Oh
I know.
God.
It healed perfectly from a blow dart going right through its body and
Wow.
only for frostbite to get it in the end, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Um,
frostbite is nasty.
it's
For folks
nasty.
that are in different parts of the country that don't see anything like frostbite, frostbite can be a determination of euthanasia or not euthanasia.
And for
Oh,
those who don't work with it or see it, it can take weeks to fully develop.
and
So
declare itself. Yeah.
yeah, so then
Hmm.
the animal seems like, okay, well, we're out of the woods, and then little by little starts showing up as
Right.
necrosis.
And yeah.
But yeah, last one is kind of our other big one is contaminant, usually pigeons. They get stuck in tar. They land on freshly paved roads. They fall into oil.
The poor things.
I know we have more oil pigeons than I'd like to admit. So those are the big ones.
And they
Yeah,
come in as orphans too. Yeah.
they do. And funny enough, they're I recommend anyone listening who hasn't ever Googled funny pigeon nests, please do so. We get a lot of orphans. Some of them are just they fledged poorly and are not adapting to life in the wild, especially pigeons. They nest in the weirdest spots in the city. So when
Hmm.
they fledge and land in a road, they can't always get back off the ground right away.
Right. Hmm.
But they also are just notorious for building really poor nests. I don't want to insult them. They're great birds. They try their best, but especially if you look up again domestic like people who keep pigeons as pets and build nests, it'll be like 3 sticks and they'll lay an egg. But I went through and did a collection for when I wrote a talk about this, and I found a picture of a mourning dove who nested in a coiled electrical cord,
Oh,
nested right in the middle of it on the ground because why not?
because why not? It's there.
Pigeons love to nest on. So, natural history. Let's go
Yeah,
back to
let's
natural history for
let's
rock pigeons.
okay, let's do that. I
There
think
is
we'll hit on
reason,
these funny things as we go.
right? So there is reason for it. Mourning doves, their natural history is they nest in trees, and most oftentimes they do. Sometimes they like to nest in gutters. So again, this is mourning doves. They like to
Hmm.
nest in gutters because it's a perfect little spot. It's protected. It's a
Until it
nice
rains.
like pre-made. Yeah. Well, they don't know that,
I
but
know they don't know that.
yeah, so mourning doves, they don't build the best nests. Some
Hmm.
do, but we often get them falling out of nests. That
Okay.
is a thing. Rock pigeons, if you can't tell by their name, naturally, in their native habitat, they nest on rock cliffs. So they make, you'll know the term for this, the scrapes. Is that what it's
Yep.
called?
It's a scrape. Yeah.
So,
Peregrine falcons are, but a
right.
lot of birds will form.
Yeah,
And basically,
yeah,
how I describe it is they land someplace, they kind of move their feet around a little bit, scrape, and say, home sweet home.
Yeah, pigeons will use areas like that
Hmm.
where it's those nice little cliff areas,
Hmm.
and then they'll build their stick nest and then lay their eggs.
Hmm.
But sometimes they don't need to build a big nest because it's already kind of a natural little crevice,
Hmm.
safe. So in our cities, which are essentially man made rock cliffs,
Hmm.
they like to nest in windowsills and right along like cliff or building edges, right?
Hmm.
Roofs. So they get themselves into a lot of trouble in that way and then fall out of nests. There's a joke across the entire internet that baby pigeons don't exist because nobody ever sees them. I don't know if you've heard that.
I have not heard
Yeah.
that.
If you go, I'm sure there's Reddit threads about it, but nobody ever sees baby pigeons. And it's because they nest in such good little crevices. Because, right, they're used to
Ah,
rock cliffs
right.
and they often nest high up. So you just rarely see them. There's a podcast called Ologies,
Oh,
which
Ologies is one of the
love
best. That's a
Ologies,
great shout out.
was an episode about pigeons. Specifically, Rosemary Moscow was the guest speaker on that one. She wrote a book called A Pocket Guide to Pigeon Watching. She talks about in that podcast how to find baby pigeons in the cities if you want
Hmm.
to, is really just learning what they sound like and listening for them.
Hmm.
But you'll see them in parking garages too. This time of year, we were just downtown St. Paul, Minnesota, and saw pigeons flying out of a garage, and I almost guarantee there's a nest somewhere in there.
Yep.
They nest year round. Fun natural
Yeah,
history
that I
fact.
knew. Oof.
Most of our nesting birds have a nesting season, and pigeons say, "Hey, it's warm in here. Here's my nest. I'm going to make more babies." And they do.
They do. Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay. So rock pigeons, we're still kind of in the natural history.
Yeah.
They nest all year round if they've
Yes.
got the resources. They make kind of a sort of a stick nest on a
Yeah.
scrape, which would be on a, in the natural world would be on a cliff face or in a little cliff crevice or something like that. But in our cities, it's certainly on buildings, under bridge decks, in garages. So what else do we need to know about rock pigeons and their natural history?
So this applies to both of them. I believe all Columbidae members, this applies, but they actually drink water very differently. And this will go into how we feed them in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But they drink water very, very differently than other birds. I don't want to say they're the only ones that do it because I try never to say all or
Always.
never
Never.
because somebody will be like, wait, no. But
Mhm.
so most birds, when they're drinking water, they'll scoop it up with their bottom beak, tip their head back, and the water goes down the esophagus, bypasses the glottis. We'll talk about epiglottis and glottis when we talk about feeding a little bit more.
Mhm.
That's how most birds drink water, right? You see them, they scoop up the water, they tip their heads back, they drink water. Perfect. Mourning doves and pigeons and other Columbidae members, they stick their beak into the water and actually drink it up. It looks like they're drinking through a straw. So
That's so
they,
cool.
right? So
Uh-huh.
they dip their beak in, drink up the water. They don't tip their head back, they just drink it up like they're sucking it up, which is very unique for their species. Very important as rehabilitators for when you're providing them a water source, a shallow dish doesn't always work. They need it a little bit deeper so that they can put their bill into it.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah. I love it. I love it. Okay. So when are they considered an adult where they will be breeding?
Ooh.
So do you know? Is it like a year?
Ooh.
Is it less than a year?
I think it's less than a year. Mourning doves might be different. For looking at the bird, for rock pigeons specifically, juvenile to adult, juveniles will have more of a brownish eye color, brownish gray, and the cere, which is right on the nares. So it's,
So
I
the
don't know how to
nose
describe
is the
it.
nares, the nose holes are the nares. Yep.
The
And it's
nares.
close, fairly close to the head.
Yes.
So far away from the tip of the bill or the beak.
In juveniles, it'll be more the color of their beak. It might be a lighter gray. But for when they're, you would admit one and say, oh, this is an adult now. Their eyes are more of a reddish orange color, and their cere is typically a bright white color.
Ah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
very helpful identification. So most rock pigeons, as far as plumage is concerned, when we're talking about adult, often are gray and with darker gray on the wings, but they come in a whole wide variety of colors. That's one of the things I love about rock pigeons.
Right.
They're so pretty. Their feathers are so pretty and so underappreciated.
No, go on any rant about how awesome pigeons are, and I will sit and listen to it for hours. So, rock pigeons, yes, they come in a huge variety of colors. There is a standard rock pigeon color
Mhm.
that you'll see more in the cities, like a standard, I can't remember how to describe it right now. But
Kind of a slate gray,
it's a
kind
slate gray. I
of.
believe it's a two bands on the wing. But there are so many color varieties. So it's a bluish gray, and then they have two black bands on the wing. So that's typically the
Mm-hmm.
standard pigeon color. Now, these birds have been domesticated for a really, really, really long time. A lot of times they started as homing birds. So those are a different type of pigeon. Those are homing pigeons, but still bred from rock pigeons.
Okay.
So when you see a lot of different colors of pigeons, you see a lot of domestic breeds. There are an incredible variety of
Mm-hmm.
domestic breeds of pigeons, but they're all derived from the rock pigeon. So that being said, there are a lot, especially in Minnesota, I know other places as well. The Twin Cities has a lot of racing pigeon groups, people who keep pigeons for possibly meat, for show pigeons. And when they get out, some can adapt, but most of the time they have a really, really hard time because they did not grow up in the wild. They don't
Right.
have those instincts really anymore
Mm-hmm.
to survive in the wild. But some do and find a mate and breed, and then you end up with all the variety of pigeons in
Oh,
the wild.
right. Yeah. So those genetics then get transferred to
Yes.
a lot of the wild
So it
birds
can
who
make
get the
it
crazy colors.
difficult when you're determining you get in a pigeon. If it's banded, it is an owned pigeon. We do not rehabilitate those because they are owned pigeons and we only rehabilitate wildlife at our center. But you can search for their owner on the National Pigeon Association website, but they are owned if they're banded. If you get one in though, and let's say you get one in and it just looks brown, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a full domestic bird. It could be a wild feral pigeon bred a while ago with a brown pigeon that escaped or was released. And this is a few generations down the line. So
Sure.
when you're driving in, especially the cities, and you see a variety of colors of pigeons, it means that they were interbred with domestic varieties.
Okay. Okay.
So it makes it difficult in rehab because you get in a fully brown pigeon doesn't mean you can't rehabilitate it if you rehabilitate rock pigeons because it could very well be a feral pigeon.
Right.
So for us, determining if it's non-banded, whether it's domestic or not, is behavior. We look at their behavior. Are they comfortable around people? Do they have the skills to survive in the wild?
And of course, you have to have the differentials. Do you have lead? Do you have head trauma?
Yes.
You have to take all that stuff into account and eliminate those.
Actually, we had a case that was really interesting with a rock pigeon that was friendly and had some mixed white and brown or white and black coloring too. And originally we thought, okay, it's a domestic, it's really friendly, but it tested for lead. It was positive for lead. And
Hmm.
each treatment, after a treatment, and the lead would go down, it would start to be wild again. It didn't want to be around us, wouldn't sit near us. It was wild
Interesting.
again. The lead would creep back up as lead does, and it would start to get friendly again. And we kept going through these up and downs of is this bird domestic or is it the lead causing neurological symptoms, which in that bird was successfully released eventually once
Sure.
its lead was under control.
Mhm.
So it's interesting.
So you mentioned earlier, I'm still on natural history of rock pigeons
Yeah.
here, that they eat pretty much anything, but they eat a lot of seeds.
Yes.
And then, of course, they pick up grit in the form of small rocks or
Mhm.
gravel or those kinds of things to help them kind of grind up the shells of those
Yes.
seeds. And they'll eat any kind of seed. Do they eat anything else?
Not really. I think they can be opportunists. You'll see them eating people food that is dropped on the street
Mhm.
in the cities. But if you're keeping pigeons or rehabbing pigeons, a full seed diet is perfect for them.
And in the wild too, I generally see them in flocks. So
Yes.
they seem to be fairly social, but I
They
don't
are
think they necessarily nest that way. Like herons and
correct.
that nest in big colonies. They kind of pigeons seem a little bit more separate when they're nesting. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so when they're nesting, they do spread out a little bit. I think they can be found like in parking garages, maybe near each other,
Mm-hmm.
but not together, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have their own little territories. This is their nesting area. But they are very, very social birds, which leads into when we talk about rehab, is housing them with conspecifics. So
Mm-hmm.
conspecifics, birds of the same species, pigeons do really well with conspecifics. You have to be a little careful with the adults because they can be territorial and fight. But juveniles, especially, we try and combine them, and they eat better. They overall seem much calmer. So yeah, very social
Cool.
birds.
You mentioned they can be territorial. In the wild, are they mostly just territorial around their nest area?
I'm not 100% sure on that one. I know in rehab in confined spaces, it can also make
Mm,
territoriality much more enhanced
yes,
because they don't
because of
have enough
stress.
space to
Yeah.
separate.
Are they polygamous? Are they,
Hmm.
do they, I don't know. I don't think they quote unquote mate for life. And that's a quote unquote because a lot of raptors, for example, actually don't mate for life. They mate to the site. They're very site oriented, so where their nest is, and they'll come back year after year to that. And they're more tied to that than they are to another bird. But I don't know what it's like with rock pigeons.
Yeah, so they can mate for life. If there's a disappearance of a mate, they'll
They'll take
repair
another
up.
one. Right, right.
But for the most part, they do stay paired up.
They stayed paired up. That is so cool. Is there, and I know there is because I've observed this, but a courtship that happens.
Yes, it's so much fun. It's my favorite when I'm driving down the interstate and they're on light poles and I can see the male displaying for a female. It's so funny. So they do a lot of bowing and cooing.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll tilt their head down and make these coo sounds and kind of just do that and try and show the female how beautiful they are.
Mm-hmm.
Pigeons have a really beautiful iridescence to their neck.
Mm-hmm.
So moving around can also show that off a little bit more as the light hits it differently.
Mm-hmm.
They also do a really gross pair bonding thing. I think it's gross. We haven't talked about this natural history part,
Uh-huh.
but listen, they are regurgitators. They We're
We're gonna talk about that a
gonna
lot.
talk about it. So, one of their pair bonding is regurgitating food into each other's mouths. It's really gross, but they love it. You'll see it. Yeah, right.
They
They
love
do.
it.
There's much more gross stuff that happens in their crop for their babies. But as
Mm-hmm.
adults, yes, they do regurgitate into each other's mouths as a sign of affection, just like anyone would want, right?
Anyone would want it. It might
Yeah.
also, I know with raptors, for example, if let's say we're talking great horned owls, the male as part of courtship will go catch mice, for
Mm.
example. And then the female will often food beg like a young owl, and then he is giving it to her. He's not necessarily feeding it to her, but handing it to her, and then she swallows it or whatever. And it is certainly thought that the female is trying to judge what kind
Mm.
of provider are you going to be, because especially when the chicks are little, she's going to spend a lot more time at the nest than he will, and he has to provide food for the chicks and for her. And a lot of raptors are like that. And then when the chicks get older, then they both have to hunt. But so
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it has something to do like that, because they do feed crop milk, which again we're going to talk
Yeah.
about, but and the both parents feed. So I don't
Yes.
I'm wondering, it's just curious to me, just wondering if that's part of trying to decide, yeah, you can help raise the kids or.
Yeah. It very well could be. I honestly
Mhm.
don't know. But leading into that, they do share parental duties. So
Mhm. They
a
do,
lot,
yeah.
not a lot of birds. It varies highly around the bird groups, but they do share parental duties. They both take turns sitting on the nest. They
Mhm.
alternate. So it's not as much of your example of great horned owls where
Right.
females primarily on the nest. These they will just switch off
Mhm.
throughout the day. And then once there are babies, they will both feed,
They'll
which we'll
both
get into
feed. That's
babies.
really cool. Yeah, we'll get into that. How about vocalizations? We know the coo. They
Mhm.
don't have an enormous variety of vocalizations, do they?
They primarily coo, that is their base
Hmm.
sound, but they do kind of make a grunty sound. They also make a lot of sound, though, whether it is a sound for any actual benefit towards one another or it's just structural, but they actually
Hmm.
make a lot of sound when they fly as well. Not
Ah.
vocalization sound, but their wings beat really, really loudly. They can make a slight
Hmm.
whistly sound.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've heard the whistly sound. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
they're very loud flyers.
Do you know how fast they can fly? Because they are fast.
Mm.
And they
I,
also can quickly maneuver in the air. It does make them, even though they might be a good meal for a predator, it is not easy to catch them.
they can fly as fast as 90 miles per hour,
Wow.
averaging about 50 to 60 miles per hour.
It's still so fast.
It's insane. I don't remember how fast the fastest homing pigeon was. So I know we're talking about rock pigeons. Homing
Hmm.
pigeons are amazing and fly insane speeds. And I don't remember where I saved that information.
That's okay. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what Cornell Birds of the World can help you with. And there you go, plugging that again. But it also, it probably has a lot to do with that they can fly so fast that they have such big pectoral muscles, right?
Oh, yeah.
They need fuel to fly, but they need the muscle mass to do it too. So, and I wonder if that also developed um in the wild because they're prey animals.
Probably they need that big muscle to fly, but they also, a behavior of theirs is wing slapping.
Ah, yes, yes, I've been
And
wing slapped.
it can hurt
Mhm.
if they're really trying. They so it is a sort of a defense mechanism of go away and they'll take their wing and just slap you with it. A lot of times it doesn't hurt, but sometimes they can hit, that bone can hit right in the perfect spot and it hurts a little bit.
So, as far as defenses, if
Yes,
they're faced with danger, flying has got to be number one for them. So
absolutely.
get away. We're gonna fly. So number two would be maybe wing slap if they can't,
Mhm.
you know. Um, and then of course, if anybody's ever been quote unquote bitten by a pigeon, it's you don't have to worry about getting bitten.
They have really soft bills.
Yes.
So you look at a cardinal and they can crunch up, they can crack open seeds. They have really hard bills. Pigeons and doves have really soft bills. They cannot crack open seeds.
Yeah, they swallow them whole, so that's hence the
Yeah.
grit.
The other, what I think is one of their coolest defense mechanisms that a lot of people
Mhm.
don't know. So pigeons and doves both have really thick feathers. Like they just have a lot of them. Not that the
Mhm.
feathers are themselves thicker, but they have a
Mhm.
lot of feathers on their body. One thing, especially mourning doves, I believe pigeons, it happens too, but if a predator were to grab the bird, they will fly off immediately. And again, this is especially for mourning doves, which we haven't talked too much about, but
Yep, we're gonna get to here. Yep.
yeah, but the predator ends up with a mouthful of feathers because they have so many feathers and they can just drop them. I mentioned I had my first bird was a dove, and one of the times he got really, really scared of something, I would call it he poofed. It would just look like a pile of feathers, and you couldn't tell on his body that he'd lost anything. But they have just
Wow.
so many body feathers that they just go poof, and there's just feathers everywhere. So it's a defense mechanism as if
Hmm.
something does get them and doesn't get a good enough hold, they can fly off, and the predator ends up with just a mouthful
And
of
then they can emergency molt if they need to,
yes,
if they've lost their whole tail or something like
right.
that. So often we talk about predatory birds versus prey birds, and prey birds, their feathers are what is called loosely seated in the follicles. So they easily release. Where predatory birds, so let's talk about raptors, right, are hard seated into the follicle. So that means that they don't come out easily, which means it can hurt a lot if you're trying to pull a feather for hopefully no reason, and you should not pull predatory bird's feathers out. But if you're pulling really hard, it does not come out easily at all, and you could really hurt the bird and actually damage the follicle if you're forcibly removing that feather. Whereas prey birds, like the doves, like the pigeons, and other prey birds too, cardinals, whatever, they're
Yeah,
pretty loosely seated. So that means they come up pretty easily. And you're right. I'm glad you brought that up as a defense mechanism because
yeah.
they can fly away and grow the feathers later if they're
Oh yeah.
alive.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's a good defense mechanism.
Mourning doves, especially, like I joke with our veterinarians at the center that if you look at them the wrong way, they're going to lose feathers.
They're gonna lose
So
feathers.
we're talking more natural history, but I keep bringing up rehab side of things for
That's
mourning
okay.
doves, especially. You have
Hmm.
to be really careful with handling them and making sure you have a good hold because they will just lose feathers.
Okay. So we have, and we're going to go pop back to rock pigeons, and then we're going to go right
Yep.
into mourning doves, talk about some of the same things with natural history and how
Yeah.
it's the same and how it's different. But with rock pigeons, approximately how long do they live?
Their lifespan in the wild can be about 6 years,
Hmm.
but I know in captivity they can live a lot longer.
Right.
I don't
That's
remember the quality
generally what it
yet.
is for a lot of species, is that they live longer because, of course, they have usually, great food, great housing, and a great medical package. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so
that
they
helps them a
average
lot.
about 2.5 years
Okay.
lifespan,
Okay.
but they can live a lot longer
A lot
if
longer
they,
than that.
yeah, if they're lucky.
If they're lucky. Okay. So let's pop over to talking a little bit natural history with mourning doves. I mean,
So,
how is it the same? How is it different?
so there's a lot that's the same, but in general, their behavior is very, very different. So if anyone listening to this has ever tried to work with mourning doves, I am sure you have a horror story of them being really difficult to rehab. Pigeons are very low stress, really adaptable, right? They're stressed out. They don't want to be touched by people, but they're pretty relaxed. They're pretty easy to keep. Mourning doves are notorious for self trauma. They are a flushing species. So, flushing birds, when there is a threat, they're afraid, they fly really fast and straight upwards. They try and just get out of there as fast as possible. And they can fly really, really fast. Like they can just go, which for in the wild is great. If there's a predator, they can just leave really quickly. In rehab, what ends up happening
Hmm.
is they fly really fast and hit the top of the enclosure immediately. So they're notorious for self trauma in captivity.
Hmm.
It's really hard to keep their feathers nice and not broken because they are easily spooked. You can reach into a pigeon cage, and most of the time they're just going to hunker down at the back and hope that you go away or wing slap you
Hmm.
or puff up their chest with air to look bigger. I
Right.
say chest, it's the air sacs around their crop. But
Hmm.
mourning doves, they might freeze for a second, hoping you don't see them, but then they're going to flush and fly and bounce off the walls. That's the biggest difference for me, especially in rehab between pigeons and doves, is doves are so high stress that
Hmm.
there are a lot of problems in rehab. And this is primarily older juveniles, adults. The babies can be a lot calmer, especially if
Hmm.
you can
Right.
raise them until they get to crazy, because they do get crazy.
Well, this informs rehab, right? It informs, like you said earlier, about you see more head trauma from hitting windows with
Yes.
doves than you do with pigeons, partly because of this behavior.
Yes.
And then it informs, okay, how are we going to house this animal? How are we going to, and maybe if, we cannot house this animal in a space that is going to be as least stressful as possible and
Mhm.
in the way they need to be, you may need to transfer that animal right away, or you may need to make the
Yeah.
decision that you cannot care for that animal.
Right.
So these are very important things about their natural history.
Yeah.
And we're not here to change their natural history. We're here to
No.
learn from it. And it's been honed, those natural history characteristics have been honed over a millennia to be effective for that
Right.
particular species.
Another one of the reasons, like, I love a challenge, and they are, I think, one of my biggest challenges for trying to figure out housing of songbird related. I know they're not
Sure.
songbirds,
Right,
but
right, right.
songbird equivalent kind of in terms of rehab, right?
Hmm.
They're really challenging. A question I see from rehabbers every single year is how do we house mourning doves? Because mine just beat up its wrists because it's flying around
Hmm.
constantly in the cage.
Hmm.
But I've had a mourning dove that got a really bad head wound in a box that was maybe an inch taller than it. That's all it took. I had it
Wow.
in a box waiting for an exam, and it just kept flushing. And there, I thought, well, there's only about an inch of space. You can't really do much. And it ended up with a pretty bad head wound because they just sit there and flush, and that's their instinct. Get out of there.
Yep. I either drop all my feathers or I have to fly away,
Right.
or both.
Those are your options.
Those
Yes.
are those are the options. So, okay, so but most of the rest of their natural history, they nest in trees and they build a stick
Mhm.
nest, maybe not a very sturdy one, but they build a stick nest. And you are finding them more in the suburban areas and farming areas, kind
Yeah,
of?
they're very suburban. They are very rural as well. So you'll find them in both. The ones that we get in are more from suburbia because they're easily found, of
Sure.
course.
Mm-hmm.
They do adapt really well to nesting around people, but they primarily nest in trees. Again, they will nest in gutters or on houses.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty adaptable, but their natural history is more nesting in trees.
Okay. What do they have a courtship similar to rock pigeons?
They do. They do a lot of bowing and cooing. They're not quite as social. You'll see them at feeders in small groups. In
Yep.
the winter, non-breeding, you might see them in bigger groups
Mm-hmm.
or migration because they do actually migrate.
Mm-hmm.
Rock pigeons, I didn't mention this, they do not migrate. They might move around based on food source, but
Or food.
they
Mm-hmm.
pretty much stay where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Mourning doves do migrate in Minnesota, in the southern part of the country. I don't believe they do as much, but most of our mourning doves do migrate. If the ones that choose not to, because they have food source and they just don't migrate,
Mm-hmm.
they will often be found in groups during non-breeding
Okay.
season.
Okay. And do they have a breeding season then? Because rock pigeons, we talked
They
about,
do.
they breed all year round.
Yes. So mourning doves, they start early and they end late. Here, it's more of a typical baby bird season. So for here, we will usually start seeing them in April, late April. And the last ones are typically in August, September.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they can nest year round in warmer climates.
Okay.
I don't know that they always do, but they can.
Okay. But here in Minnesota, they generally don't.
Yeah, we won't get babies between definitely October through like mid-April.
Okay.
And it's primarily because they migrate.
Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buhl. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit theraptorcenter.umn.edu. Our producer is Reese Rosado. Special thanks to our guest Partners for Wildlife, the Raptor Center at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. Hope you'll join us again, especially for part 2.